demonstration in Richmond Park as Tory MP Zac Goldsmith resigns in protest. Good evening from the Five Bells pub in the heart of Harmondsworth, a village of 10,000 souls that will eventually be disintegrated by Heathrow's third runway and its construction. Here in the local pub they speak of betrayal, of David Cameron's no ifs, no buts pledged 6 years ago there'd be no Heathrow expansion, and also of nearby MP Theresa May, her long years of campaigning against such a plan. Already political turbulence. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson predicts it will never be built, and Tory MP Zac Goldsmith quits altogether his seat in protest, sparking a by-election.
This election must be a referendum on Heathrow expansion. It is our chance to send a message to government and to Heathrow via the ballot box.
Also tonight, the Iraqi army tells Channel 4 News they'll be at the gates of Mosul within 3 or 4 days. Our correspondent makes a shocking return to what was a Christian town near Mosul after Islamic State militants were driven out. The demolition of the jungle camp in Calais has begun as people who lived there are being bussed all over France. As Russia says it hasn't bombed Aleppo for a week, the Syrian army is seen on the ground on the doorstep of rebel-held areas. And back to school in East Aleppo, where children learn in underground classrooms.
48 years ago, Harold Wilson's government looked into the expansion of Heathrow Airport. Before the 2010 general election, a third runway was given the go-ahead and planning permission, but was then cancelled by the coalition government. Today, Theresa May became another government to decide a third runway. Here is the best way to expand Heathrow Airport's capacity. But the announcement from Transport Secretary Chris Grayling has been met with passionate opposition. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is live in Westminster. Gary.
Well, the chances of a third runway getting through Parliament have probably never looked better. There are perhaps a few dozen Tory rebels. There's most of the Labour Party on board, the SNP, the DUP. The real problems that lie ahead could well lie in legal challenges, because environmental law in particular is a pretty ripe area for that to be explored. But the new challenge we've heard of tonight is a by-election challenge. Zac Goldsmith, a Tory MP who's long been an opponent of a third runway, and his constituency, Richmond, is in the flight path, has turned around and said he's going to stand down as a Conservative, fight as an independent in a by-election. And amazingly, in the last hour or so, we've heard that the Conservatives are not going to run a candidate against him because they said he's been a good constituency MP. Phooey is one thing you could say to that. They're doing it because they're terrified the Lib Dems might come in and make that by-election a referendum on Brexit in an area that was very strongly pro-Remain. Brexit was what stirred the government to action on this runway because they were terrified that Brexit might make the country look like it was closing its doors on the world.
Heathrow expansion was first raised by a government 48 years ago. It became official government policy when Labour was last in power, before David Cameron's coalition killed it off. Now, a Conservative government, led by a former critic, has said yes. And a blast of high decibel opposition has greeted the move. The government wants the new runway northwest of the existing 2 runways at Heathrow. It'll run over the M25, which will have to be tunnelled underneath. Some 780 homes will be compulsory purchased for demolition. Another 3,750 in the vicinity could be bought up at 25% above market rates.
Expansion will not be at any cost to local people, to passengers or to industry. We have to make Heathrow a better neighbour. We must tackle air quality and noise and meet our obligations on carbon both during and after construction.
The Transport Secretary insisted new noise performance targets and a 6.5-hour night flight ban would mean fewer people were affected by plane noise than are now. Campaigners rubbished that, and ministers with long-standing records of opposition to Heathrow expansion have been allowed to criticise government policy.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving me and others the freedom to make our points. And I do intend to do that in a useful way. I think that there are some very crucial facts that people need to understand about the third runway. It's very difficult to finance it. It will cause an immense amount of disruption. You have to build over the M25. There are colossal problems still to be solved. And then you have a future in which London will be flown over by 250,000 more flights per year, with, I'm afraid, an inevitable degradation of the quality of people's lives. No other great city would do this to its inhabitants. As I say, New York is going to be the city of beautiful skyscrapers, Paris the city of lights. London in the future, if we go ahead with this project, will be known as the city of planes.
Tonight, the Conservative MP Zach Goldsmith has resigned as MP for the flight path constituency of Richmond Park to force a by-election on the issue of Heathrow expansion.
This election must be a referendum on Heathrow expansion. It is our chance to send a message to government and to Heathrow via the ballot box. And so I'm asking you to give me the mandate I need to continue fighting this fight. Thank you all very much indeed for coming.
Supporters of Heathrow expansion say the airport's main European rivals as hub airports with much sought-after connections, Frankfurt, Paris, Charles de Gaulle and Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, have been able to grow their destinations, compared with Heathrow, which hasn't been able to strike out on new routes to areas like Asia.
My constituents face the prospect of a reduction in their quality of life with more planes flying overhead, the prospect of being restricted in driving their cars locally.
Theresa May objecting to Heathrow on behalf of her flight path constituency, Maidenhead. Number 10 says they've secured a better deal now for those affected. Today is a milestone on the long journey by governments wanting to expand airport capacity in the south-east of England.
I come from Heathrow Airport. I came down here for peace.
You lived in the Heathrow
Yes,
area?
I lived at Hounslow.
This saga has hovered over many locations, but after much circling, it's now returned, with government backing and a big cross-party majority this time, to Heathrow.
Well, as you've heard, Zach Goldsmith, the Conservative MP, has resigned over the new runway, forcing a by-election in his constituency of Richmond Park, directly under the flight paths. The ex-London mayoral candidate has long fought against expansion, and today he said the government's course was doomed. Fatima Manji is in Richmond. Fatima.
Thanks, John. Yes, just about an hour and a half ago, we sat inside there with a small group of Zach Goldsmith supporters, including some sitting Conservative councillors, as he announced that he indeed would be resigning, that this would trigger a by-election and that he would now run as an independent candidate. Now, Zach Goldsmith has insisted that the Heathrow decision is catastrophic, that it will be a millstone around the government's neck. He says he wants this to be a referendum about Heathrow, except the Conservatives have confirmed they're not fielding a candidate against him. So it's going to be a straight fight, Zach Goldsmith versus the Lib Dems, who also oppose Heathrow expansion, which begs the question, what could this actually be a referendum on? Well, how about this? The EU. This is one of the most pro-Remain constituencies in the country. Zach Goldsmith backed Brexit. So the Lib Dems could make a play on that. And a few minutes ago, I found Zach Goldsmith in a pub just around the corner, and I asked him what he would do if the Lib Dems went big on the idea of remaining in the EU as an issue in this by-election.
Parties will be tempted to exploit any situation, but the reality is this is a referendum on Heathrow. This is an outrage for this community. You could walk down the street and talk to almost anyone, and you'll see that they share my view about the proposals the government's put forward. This is about Heathrow, and that's what I'm going to focus on.
But you must be very confident in your personal popularity.
Thank you very much.
Okay, is Linton Crosby going to run your campaign?
This is a very grassroots campaign today.
All right, thank you very much, guys.
Now, Linton Crosby there, the political strategist I was asking him about, who worked on his mayoral campaign. Zach Goldsmith's recent mayoral campaign, which was unsuccessful, obviously, was pretty controversial. He was accused of dog whistling, he was accused of smearing his opponent as an extremist, and senior Conservatives actually criticised him for it. So the question is, will Zach Goldsmith's personal mandate be enough in this election, or could the Lib Dems cause an upset?
Fatima Manji over there in Richmond. Now, earlier, before Zach Goldsmith officially resigned, I spoke to Transport Secretary Chris Grayling, as it happens right under the flight path of London City Airport. I began by asking him why it's taken the government so long to make a decision.
Now, I've been Transport Secretary 3 months, the Prime Minister's been Prime Minister 3 months. We believe there's a need to get on with it. But if you
look very good, that's true. You've done 3 months, but let's face it, this has been hanging around. It really is an insight into the way bad governance continues in this country.
Well, if you look at what we've been doing since the last report to the House this time last year, 10 months ago, what we've done is go back and look really carefully at the issue of air quality. This is something we have to get right, perhaps above anything else. It's an issue that is driven not simply by the airport, but much more broadly by congestion in West London, indeed in other towns and cities. We've done independent research. We've produced a new strategy since the Airports Commission reported. We have other measures in the pipeline. We intend to make sure that this issue has been long addressed by the time we get to the point where a new runway opens.
Zach Goldsmith has told his constituency chairman he's going to resign. Are you going to fight that by-election?
Look, I'm not going to anticipate anything that Zach may say. He's just been in the House of Commons, asked me a question. I respect enormously Zach's integrity as a constituency politician.
He will resign. You won't oppose him that he's in the by-election. And another Tory, he will be a Tory, but he won't call himself a Tory, will be in the House and you'll be fine.
I think anyone who knows Zach knows the one thing he would never get involved in is what you call a fix-up. Zach is a man of great principle. I respect him for that. He believes passionately in his view on this. I believe very strongly that we are doing the right thing for this country.
There are cascades of men of great principle, mainly men, it must be said. There are a few women. And they've all done the same thing. We are opposed to the airport under all circumstances. Bang. We're still MPs, we're not going to resign, and we're not going to vote against the party.
Well, I think Zach is a person of great principle and integrity. He's clearly taken a very clear position on this issue. I respect him for that. On the Airports Committee this morning, we were unanimous in our view that we were taking the right decision in the interest of the country.
When will this airport have its third runway completed and in service?
The timetable is around the middle of the next decade. It's a process that's longer than I would wish, but it's a process that's faster than it would have been in the past. And we want to get on with this as quickly as possible.
Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
You're very welcome.
In a moment, the local MP, none other than the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. But first, the Cabinet was split, and numerous environmental groups objected, but the majority of business groups welcomed the decision. Theresa May said it proves post-Brexit Britain can be an open, global, successful country. Our business correspondent Helia Ebrahimi has this report.
The fast pace of Heathrow, rather a mismatch to its torpid progress.
Come fly with me, let's fly away.
Many still doubt today's decision will deliver the capacity business needs without being thrown off course again. Decades late, still uncertain, and at a moment in history when Britain needs to be at its most competitive.
We are falling behind very quickly, and if it's going to take us 10 years to build one runway, we're in trouble.
Steve O'Keefe's company transports and loads more than 30,000 tonnes of cargo a year.
For the UK, we need business. Every plane that takes off, it may be a noise, but on there is money, there's industry, and it's exports, leaving the UK to the global market, bringing wealth to the UK. If we don't grow with the industry, HQs are going to move to Europe, and business will move. We'll slowly decline.
It looks like we've averted a recession this year, but a post-Brexit Britain needs to make the most of every advantage it has. We may be a nation of shopkeepers, but there's no point if we can't get our goods and our services into shops across the world. Black Swan is Britain's fastest growing tech startup. It's planning to make half of its sales in the US next year and says airport links are its #1 priority.
We work with large multinational companies that tend to have their key decision makers out in the US. So it's really important that we're able to go out there and travel and speak to those people when we need to.
For a property company like Aurora, today's decision has been the culmination of years of campaigning.
Well, I think it's fantastic. We've all been waiting for a long, long time, over a decade, for this decision. And previously, the governments have not really had the courage to make a decision. You're never going to please 100%, but at least I think the government have made the decision, a positive decision, that Britain is open for business, especially after Brexit. And I think it's great that we've got a decision that we can start working towards.
But not everyone's so optimistic about today's announcement.
I think we've cleared a couple of hurdles today, but I think it'd be foolish for people to believe it's a done deal.
The new Heathrow will land at a cost of £17.6 billion, with taxpayers' contribution making up to £5 billion, as flights out of Heathrow climb from 480,000 to 740,000, and passenger numbers almost double to 138 million people. Over 60 years, the economic benefit is forecast to be as much as £147 billion. The key issue for the BA boss is how much it will end up costing customers.
I think it's a good idea if it can be built within the existing charges at Heathrow. If it can't be done within the existing charges, well then no, it should not be built.
Why not? What are the risks?
Because the risks are that you price Heathrow out of the market. And if you're to generate economic benefit, and you've heard what the airport has had to say, they've been out there making these promises, giving commitments, telling everybody how wonderful it's going to be. If they're to deliver on that, they're going to have to take the risk associated with the financial investment. And they cannot expect to transfer that risk to airlines and to customers using the airport.
High praise for the May government, or bells and whistles for the woman who oversaw a decision 8 previous prime ministers failed to deliver. Infrastructure hasn't been our strong suit, but perhaps Heathrow's new runway demonstrates a new departure.
Come fly with me, let's fly.
Of course, that's if politics doesn't get in the way.
Pack up, let's fly away.
Well, now this pub is in the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's constituency, and he joins us live now. John McDonnell, you've spoken out very, very strongly for big infrastructural projects, but is it just the ones in your back garden that you're against?
No, but let's be clear about it. This is an appalling decision today. This decision is toxic, both in terms of, yes, the brutality of what it will mean for my constituents, 8,000 to 10,000 being forced out of their homes, losing their whole community, but actually in terms of the environmental impact generally as well. It means we won't be able to meet our climate change targets. It means something like nearly up to 1 million Londoners will now suffer additional noise. It means air pollution in this area and across London, which is already above the EU levels. It means it will get worse. We'll be poisoning our own people. For all of those factors, this is the worst decision in terms of infrastructure investment this government could make.
There is one silver lining, and that is a lot of jobs, and you really want jobs.
Well, the reality is this. It's interesting because as the airport has developed, it's brought us jobs, but it's also cost us jobs. Land prices have gone up, and we've lost our manufacturing base in this area. So there are some employment benefits, certainly, not as many as this airport says. It always exaggerates the figures, but it's cost us skilled jobs as well, replaced large numbers of skilled jobs with semi-skilled, non-skilled jobs, and not necessarily the wages that we need in this area.
The difficulty is that if you look around Europe, just about every major airport has been expanded, some of them a long time ago. President de Gaulle increased the airport there by a runway or two. There are 4 runways, 5 at Schiphol. There's more at Frankfurt. You know, this old airport here's got 2 runways.
Well, what's interesting is that our capital city outperforms all the others because we've got 5 airports, and if we coordinate those
well,
airports...
this one's losing business to Schiphol.
Well, let's be realistic. We've got Stansted standing half empty at the moment. We've got 5 airports. We ship more passengers than anywhere else, and including freight as well. What we need to do is make sure they're working more effectively together, and they're working more intensively. Now, as I said, Stansted standing half empty, Gatwick desperate to expand without the environmental consequences.
But you could see this coming down the line. Why didn't you stand up with a plan that actually spelt out exactly what was going to happen, how you could make Stansted work? My God, you'd need a high-speed rail link there, wouldn't you?
We have done. For 30 years, the first anti-third runway meeting I held in this constituency was 30 years ago, and since then, environmental aviationists have actually been putting forward alternatives to Heathrow. Unfortunately, this government, as previous governments, have not listened to them. But the reality is this will not go ahead. We will beat them in the courts yet again.
It's going to be a free vote for Labour MPs, isn't it?
Yeah, but the reality is
because actually the Labour Party, most MPs in the House of Commons are in favour of it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because all the different political parties over the years have changed tack once they're confronted with the toxicity of the issue itself, both in terms
Well, Labour MPs haven't.
Well, they will do, because they have done
Do you think
before.
they'll vote against it?
Only previously we were opposed to it, and then now we're in favour.
Will you resign if you lose?
No, what I'll be doing is make sure we mobilise a campaign against it, and we'll beat them in the courts, we'll beat them politically, and we'll mobilise communities. This will be the iconic struggle against, basically, corporate interest undermining our attempts to tackle climate change.
Just in case you missed the point, there is in fact a pub here, and I'm in the middle of it, and it's a bit on the protesting side, one could say. So, John McDonnell, thank you very much indeed for joining us. More from here later, but for now, let's go back to Krishnan in the studio.
Thanks, John. Now, in Iraq, the commander of the 9th Armoured Division has told Channel 4 News he expects Iraqi forces to reach the city of Mosul within 3 or 4 days. He claimed so-called Islamic State had used suicide bombers, but had been unprepared to fight street battles in the town of Hamdania, which was recaptured yesterday. More than 50,000 people were forced to flee the Christian town 2 years ago when jihadists seized it. But after days of fighting, the Iraqi army has just succeeded in retaking it. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman was there.
For 2 hours, we followed dirt tracks along the Iraqi front line, in convoy with the 9th Armoured Division, flying the flag of Shia Islam to protect them from harm, into the ghost town that is Hamdania, shattered, deserted, flattened by coalition airstrikes, its homes, schools and hospitals ransacked by ISIS fighters. This is the Church of the Immaculate. The biggest church in Iraq, in fact. And it seems to have been used for target practice. Everything burned or stolen or hacked into tiny pieces, apart from the altar itself. This is the biggest church in the biggest Christian town in Iraq, and it's been completely gutted. And you have to ask yourself, will the Christians who fled from here over 2 years ago really dare to come back? But 2 brave priests have come back, for the first time since 50,000 Christians escaped, many of them in the middle of the night. And they're offering prayers in ancient Aramaic once again. What do you think when you see all this?
So when we entered to this church, it was a very big shock for me. It was very, very beautiful church. We pray in this church. We celebrated the Mass and the prayers here. It was a very big shock to see it in this situation. But really, I'm very happy because I could return back to here again, pray, put the cross under the church.
Around the corner, Iraqi troops are guarding a large cache of ISIS mortars. We control the whole town, one of them told me. We're only 12 miles from Mosul. Mosul, here we come. Hamdania is not safe from pockets of resistance, though. An ISIS sniper is believed to be holding out in this building. This door looks as if it's been booby-trapped, and it could take more than a week before this battlefield is made secure. Hamdania has its native guardians, 250 Christian militia known as the Nineveh Protection Units, here to stop any more looting and to persuade the missing 50,000 to come home.
God willing, people will come back from the rest of Iraq and abroad, maybe in days or in months. It depends on how we clean the town up.
Iraq's 9th Armoured say a combination of their men and coalition airstrikes killed around 75 militants here, and that ISIS is not putting up as much of a fight as it makes out. Doesn't it make you think that when you get to Mosul you may have to fight street by street, because they put up a fight here?
No, the enemy was only using suicide vehicles and mines, but he has no readiness to fight us in the street. We're working on the villages around Mosul now, liberating them. Within 3 or 4 days, we will reach Mosul itself.
It feels as if an uneasy coalition is making progress here, Christian militiamen, Kurds, the Iraqi army. You wouldn't call them angels, but the 50,000 absent souls of Hamdaniya do have their guardians now, in a town just beginning to come back to life. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Hamdaniya.
The Russian Defense Ministry says Russian and Syrian military planes have not launched airstrikes on Aleppo over the last 7 days. This contradicts opposition fighters on the ground and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, who claim bombing and shelling on frontline areas has resumed. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
The sight, the noise is from another century. The Syrian army filmed this just 2 days ago southwest of Aleppo. A rebel soldier ringed just meters from Assad's forces attempting to take this hilltop position. Russia may have suspended airstrikes for several days over East Aleppo, but all around, by ground and air, the war grinds on. And all the time, she's getting nearer. The Soviet-era Russian carrier heading a battle group, the like of which the world hasn't seen from Russia in a generation or more. Destination, Syrian waters. Current location, Gibraltar.
This raises serious questions and concerns over Russia's commitment to working to a political solution to the conflict in Syria. And more airstrikes by Russian planes will exacerbate the humanitarian suffering in Aleppo.
Russia's paused the bombing for some days, yet the UN's failed to get agreement to bring out one single sick or injured person from besieged East Aleppo, where artillery duels and sniping continue. The Russian and Syrian government alliance dropped leaflets over the east today, telling 250,000 people there to get out while they still can. So far, just 48 of around 250,000 have done so, without any UN cover. Russian TV on hand to greet them in government-controlled West Aleppo. How freely they could speak can't be verified.
The kids are suffering because of the rebels. They're having hallucinations from the terror of them. You can't say anything against them. They'll cut your hand off or your head.
But video put out by activists in the rebel-held East shows people blaming the government and Russian forces. Again, we don't know if they're speaking under duress.
The escape routes are just a way to force us out. It means leaving our homes and our land. We're all against this.
More protests in the east demanding that nobody should leave the besieged area. Spontaneous, coerced, we don't know. But for many here, leaving East Aleppo does mean accepting defeat. So there's no sign of meaningful peace talks, there's no sign of the UN able to get anyone out safely, and all the while Russia is bringing up reinforcements.
Now, the children of Aleppo have been some of the biggest casualties of the war. It's the beginning of the school year at the moment, and according to the children's charity UNICEF, 1 in 3 schools in Syria are out of action because they've either been destroyed by airstrikes or are being used in the fighting. Since the war began more than 5 years ago, there have been over 4,000 attacks on schools across the country. In East Aleppo, thousands of children are staying away from class, but for those brave enough to go, they are having to go underground for an education. The sound of children playing is the same all over the world, but in Aleppo, being out in the open is a risk. The schools here have gone underground, but in a country where nearly 1.7 million children have no school to go to anymore, at least these kids are learning.
My name is Miss Brown. What is your name? Stand up. Stand up. What is your name? Ismuki. What is the name?
Tired eyes from children kept awake by war.
How are you?
Learning a new language is a good distraction.
1, 2, 3. Hello, stand up, sit down. Hello, stand up, sit down.
for a few hours in the day, a chance to be ordinary children at school, preparing for their futures, whatever it turns out to be. As the school day ends, they emerge back at ground level. The UN says that since the war began, there have been over 4,000 attacks on schools in Syria, and there's no sign on their faces of the dangers ahead on the walk home. They spot one of the warplanes that have become routine over East Aleppo, but don't appear scared, even though these are the very planes that have brought death and destruction for almost all of their tiny lives. They go on to their own unique after-school club.
جاهزين الكل؟ ثواني بس. طلع هي احمد الاخضر هذا احمد. اسمع انا قلت انتبهوا بس في البث. رح نهزها هيك ماشي؟ هزها لاشوف.
Subverting the debris of war with spray paint. Banksy would be proud. Though there's no doubt they're being taught who the enemy is. On what appears to be a Russian-made bomb, they spray the red stars of revolution. The scars of war here have been transformed into playthings. The burnt-out bus becomes a treasure, a playground for their imagination. But instead of nursery rhymes, these children sing a famous rebel song for the camera. And a new song for the Syrian president, who's bombing East Aleppo. It might look like a playground from hell, but perhaps it just underlines how, wherever they are, children need to play, whatever's happening around them. And to see all our reports from Inside Aleppo, go to InsideAleppo.com. Now in Calais, the demolition of the jungle camp has begun. Coachloads of refugees, nearly 3,000 since Monday, have already been dispersed across France. Only children are allowed to stay in Calais, and several hundred will arrive in Britain in the next 3 weeks. Our reporter Porrick O'Brien is in Calais. What's the latest?
Well, Krish, we've just had the new figures from the Interior Minister about the amount of people that they've managed to clear from the jungle and relocate to other places in France. And it now stands at 4,000, actually, which is, they will consider that a great success, French officials. Now, population estimates are something of a fool's game when it comes to the jungle, but that would probably mean between 1,000 and 2,000 people remain in the camp behind me. In other news, we also spoke to the mayor of Calais today, and I asked her what's going to become of this site once it's cleared. She told us that it's going to probably become a small industrial park complete with a large artificial lake. But the big news of the day was that a section of the camp to the left of where I'm standing now started to be physically cleared. The bulldozers moved in. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The refugee camp, 20 miles from Kent, that served as a lightning rod for electrified politics, for the hopes of some, for the fears of others. And at about 3 o'clock today, 2 small diggers, an army of workmen and riot police started dismantling the jungle. So thus it begins. Thousands of lives have been through this place. Millions of euros and pounds spent on it. Thousands of column inches and a few political lives on the line as well. Why do you think it's taken so long?
Because the government wasn't listening. They didn't get it. How many people were here, how awful the conditions were. It became unbearable.
parallel to the demolition. At dawn, the scramble for a place in the queue out. Mainly teenage boys trying to get a place in the queue for unaccompanied minors. All too much for some. It turns out the crush of the queue, the least of these two teenagers' worries. They're leaving for the UK tomorrow under the Dubs Amendment. But today, on their way to buy snacks for the journey, a man in a car drove past and shot at them.
And they hear boom and smoke, and these guys and other guys run. He say, what it's happened? And she say, guys, shut.
Later, the mayor of Calais confirmed the incident to us. Police have taken statements and will investigate whether the rounds were live or not. Another trauma to pile on top of the rest. The process of clearing and relocating is working, though. Officials say about half the jungle population has now been vacated. That still leaves a lot of people, though, either digging in at camp or disappearing into the countryside. There are about 3,000 police officers focused on Calais town, but a far more tricky security operation is also underway for fear that refugees and migrants will disperse into the countryside around Calais. So, for example, here in the forest of Guine, about 20 kilometres south of Calais, locals told us that a team of police officers showed up this morning and started combing through the forest after reports that refugees and migrants were making camp here. Tonight, as news of demolition spreads, the self-started wildfires do too. Protest, resignation, the jungle's funeral pyre.
The Labour Party has been fined £20,000 for undeclared spending at the last general election. The infamous Edstone, which had the party's key election pledges carved into it, cost £7,000 and is amongst missing election expenses. Paul McNamara reports.
These 6 pledges are now carved in stone.
It was hoped this would be a campaign monument. It soon became the Edstone and ended up a rock to beat Mr Miliband with. And today, this 8-foot 6-inch election stunt delivered its final blow, a hefty fine from the Electoral Commission. Every penny political parties spend during an election needs to be declared with the authorities. And when Labour submitted their spending return for last year's general election, a couple of receipts were noticeable by their absence. These two for the Edstone totalling £7,614. It prompted an investigation by the Electoral Commission. But those 2 invoices weren't the only payments Ed Miliband's campaign team failed to declare. The Electoral Commission found 74 missing payments for the 2015 general election, totalling almost £124,000, or completely undeclared on their spending return, an error worthy of a £20,000 fine, the maximum the Electoral Commission can hand out, but no other action.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ian McNichol, General Secretary of the Labour Party.
This is the man ultimately responsible, and the Electoral Commission report says Ian McNichol has committed 2 election offences. But today, Labour blamed the mistakes on problems with internal procedures. They said,
"The party regrets these administrative errors. However, these amounted to just over 1% of our total spending of over £12 million during this election. We accept the findings of the report and have already tightened our internal recordings procedures to address the Commission's concerns."
Campaigners are now calling for a complete overhaul to the way expenses are declared.
Because let's not forget that it's not just the Labour Party's expenses that have been called into question. We need much greater transparency in election expenses return. They need to be published online, so it's much easier to check if parties are making errors or failing to declare expenses.
The other party being investigated is the Conservative Party. Their activists shown here touring the country on its Battle Bus 2015 campaign. Earlier this year, a Channel 4 News investigation discovered tens of thousands of pounds of seemingly undeclared accommodation expenses. Tonight, the Electoral Commission refused to say when their findings will be delivered.
After the break, we look at the environmental implications of a third runway at Heathrow. Many supporters of the airport say that developments in technology will mitigate against negative consequences. But the United Kingdom is already breaching EU limits for nitrogen dioxide linked to respiratory illnesses. What will more flights mean? Welcome back to the Five Bells in Harmondsworth. Literally, the perimeter fence will run about 50 yards from the back wall of this pub here. Here, there's long been passionate opposition to the third runway. Campaigners and communities say expansion will increase the number of flights and traffic around the airport, pushing up pollution in the capital, which already breaches legal limits for air quality. Leading scientists warn it will be a serious obstacle to fighting climate change. Our science editor, Tom Clark, joins me now. Tom, what are the environmental implications for the government?
Two big ones from today's announcement. Some would say insurmountable ones. The first you mentioned there, John McDonnell mentioned earlier too, air pollution. We're in legal breach of air pollution limits because of ground transportation to, from and around Heathrow Airport. The government was ordered by the Supreme Court in April last year to do more about air pollution. Having another runway at Heathrow only makes it more challenging. Some people say they could possibly reduce it down slightly, but that would mean an overhaul of ground infrastructure to and from the airport, not just locally, but across the southeast of England. The second major challenge, climate change. We've got legally binding climate change targets in the UK and international ones now too. If we don't do enough to reduce those, we then leave ourselves open to further challenge. The rest of the British economy is reducing its emissions. Aviation, it's growing. So people are asking today, why does aviation get a free upgrade into club class over this one?
Well, thank you very much, Tom Clark. I'm going back to my pub bar here, where I'm going to have some guests joining me now in favour. Are Dale Keller of the Board of Airline Representatives, Craig Beaumont from the Federation of Small Businesses, and against Rebecca Newsom from Greenpeace and Bob Barnstone from Stop Heathrow Expansion. Now, Ailish Stone is a local resident, and in a sense, you are the human consequence of what's been decided today by the Prime Minister and her cabinet. How long have you lived here?
I've lived in the Heathrow villages for over 40 years. I originally lived in Longford Village in the 70s, and I moved to Harmondsworth in 1987.
Both afflicted by the same?
Both afflicted, yes.
All your children were born here?
Yes, they were born in the villages.
And what
yes.
will it mean to you and your family?
Well, my home will be in the demolition zone, so I think my house will be dead centre on a new runway if expansion happened.
And I believe that within literally, 4 hours, you got a letter?
Yes, we did. Yes.
Well, stating basically your house is going to rip down if everything happens.
Yes. It's designated as the preferred option.
We have been here before.
We have, and we won last time, and we will win again. You know, we will fight this to the bitter end.
Right. Well, now, Dale, you have a difficult task here, but from the airline point of view, what is your response? I mean, there is obviously going to be a human consequence. Why will the gain be so great that it's worth moving eventually perhaps 10,000 people from their homes?
Look, it's been a very long time coming, this decision, but we have a decision from the government of their preference. I think why it's taken so long is simply because of the feeling with communities. And you have to remember that those communities around the airport are not just our communities, they're neighbours of the airlines and the airport community. They're also our employees and our customers. And I think that the good work put forward by the communities is one of the main reasons that it's taken so long, and we've got a totally different scheme on the table today than we had a few years ago.
This is the difficulty, Bob, isn't it? That a lot of people sort of living around here actually depend on the airport anyway, and if you let it die, or indeed you don't keep moving with the times, you're going to be out of work.
Well, of course, there are lots of people that live in this area that work at Heathrow Airport, but we've already seen that when the airport last expanded under Terminal 5, that the number of jobs that were created at Terminal 5 were not as many as Heathrow Airport said that they were going to be when they applied for the terminal in the 1990s. So, yes, I think the jobs are important, but at the same time, you know, we can't always believe everything that we hear from Heathrow Airport.
Craig, from a small business point of view, and there are a lot of small businesses affected by this, is it a plus or a minus?
Overall, it's a plus. So it's a plus mainly because of the £211 billion of GDP that will be generated by this decision. We've wasted a lot of time getting to this point. And while it's difficult for this crowd to hear this today, there are pubs right now in Belfast, in Liverpool, in Durham, all these places are finally going to be connected into the airport network, and these are communities that will also benefit. So it's difficult here, and it's a difficult message, I know, to convey, but this is about economic growth and jobs and Britain not falling behind the rest of the UK economy. Sorry, US.
Rob, how do you carry that?
Well, I think that it's very difficult. Obviously, we're in a place where thousands of people are going to lose their homes. And I think it's, people are feeling very worried and distressed. So what I would say is that, yes, it's a very difficult issue for people in this community. But at the same time, the arguments against a third runway at Heathrow are very, very strong. The amount of people that are affected by aircraft noise is around Heathrow is 28% of all the people across Europe that are affected by aircraft noise. We see air pollution limits being very high, and the congestion that's going to be brought to this area is going to be unbelievable. So actually, I think that there are very strong reasons why a third runway shouldn't happen, and that's what we're going to continue fighting for.
Yes, indeed. Just because of the bit that's missing in this is about exports. So post-Brexit, if we are to be an exporting nation, we need to be able to export products and services and British expertise. So Hinkley Point, High Speed 2 and Heathrow are 3 statements of intent that says the economy is going to be protected in the longer term. And I know it's difficult, but that's where we stand.
Rebecca.
I would want to just actually look into the statistics a bit more on that and debunk the business argument, because if we look at international flights going out of the UK, only 1/6 of those are business flights. And we also know that over the last 10 years, business flights have been decreasing. So I think the business case for this is far from clear, and on top of that, there are huge.
Exports, not business flights,
I think these things are connected, and I think on top of that, there are huge questions about costs for the British taxpayer, where answers have not been given yet on how we're going to meet the £17 billion hole on surface access costs that have been forecast by Transport for London. I don't know where that's going to come from.
I mean, let's not talk about business flights and leisure flights. Every flight has a complete mix of passengers. You might be sitting next to an exporter. In the cargo hold of that aircraft could be a component for a production line in Newcastle. It's all about the connectivity. This country's been at the forefront of connectivity for over 200 years. The rest of the world's nipping at our toes. They want a slice of the action. If you were the government, would you want to give away an industry that this country is incredibly good at?
Isn't the big problem that somebody somewhere has to lay down their lives, if you like? I mean, it's a terrible thing, but you will be paid, basically, to leave.
Compensation. It's an absolute insult to say that we can be compensated for the loss of our home, our memories, our community. Nothing can buy that. Nothing will compensate us for the loss that we will experience.
Yeah, we're already losing because of Brexit.
Well, you've got to look at the opportunity as well as the disbenefits, and that's not popular here.
Well, you could,
but
you could, I suppose, argue that after Brexit, we're going to need Heathrow even more to go to Chile and Argentina and Australia and all these other places. They say they're going to make this economy work.
Even locally, we've talked to businesses locally, and there is a balance of view even locally amongst local businesses, because there are local exporters who see an opportunity. And I know that's not popular here, but it's going to happen, and it's going to help.
It is a terrible problem between, the 10,000 people and their lives, their whole lives in a way affected by this, and the prosperity of the nation. I mean, how do you lay that off?
I think there's absolutely no question. I think no one disputes that. But I think the government has looked at all the evidence. 3 years of an independent airports commission. The business case for Heathrow has been there for decades. The social and environmental issues are why it's taken so long. We suddenly have some transformational things happening with surface transport. Airspace modernisation can reduce emissions by 9 to 14%. That's a low-hanging fruit. Let's work with the environmentalists to make it happen.
Of course, neither of you have talked about the environmental implications. And it's all very well saying they're going to ameliorate them, but we know, full stop, that Heathrow will pollute more than it did.
The Climate Change Committee says that we can actually expand Heathrow within the UK's targets. Aviation is less than...
You don't think some pigs will land at the airport? Pigs flying.
Well,
well done, John.
Shush, hear him out.
But let's have
Shush.
But some facts there. See, most people think that aviation is the #1 polluter. Less than 6% of the UK's carbon emissions come from aviation, 4% globally. Let's tackle road
very briefly.
Well, I think that's not true. And by 2050, aviation without any expansion is forecast to take up 50% of our carbon budgets. This is simply not sustainable. And we need to bear in mind the global context here. We have had the Global Paris Climate Change Agreement signed by this government less than a year ago.
We're going to have to leave it there, alas. Tragically, the clock has beaten us, but I think we've opened it all up to discussion. That's Channel 4 News. We're back tomorrow evening, usual time. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.